meeting and continue with Eric Sorensen.
Thank you. Apologies for that delay. Next slide, please, Catherine. Before I talk about Vermont, I just wanted to zoom out and look at the big picture for a minute. And if we think about our planet and what it provides for us, I think it's a kind of an important segue when we start thinking more locally at the national or state or even municipal level. Next slide, please. The Earth has this wonderful atmosphere that protects us from all kinds of radiation and is the sort of the blanket that covers us. And just sort of always, for me, always remembering that it's a relatively small place, a relatively small planet, and that our actions carry over the distance. Next, please. So I want to focus a little bit more just here on Vermont. Next, please. And starting with bedrock as sort of an underlying feature of biological diversity. The map on the left is a map produced by the State Geologist's Office. You can see the folks in Vermont down there. And it is a wonderful map. That map that here is pretty small, you can get as a 4 foot by 8 foot version. And it has over 500 geologic units. Each geologic unit is described for its characteristics. It's a taxonomic system, really, but also what they're made of, how they were developed, when they were formed. And the history, the geologic history of Vermont is fascinating, from continents colliding to old oceans and the sediments in old oceans, upheaval of mountains. And some of our mountains, the Green Mountains, are very old. There are some places where in the southern Green Mountains and in the Taconics, there's been a flip, and some of the mountains are upside down. Some of the bedrock is upside down on top of the adjacent mountains. So it's just a fascinating beginning. And bedrock is sort of that underlying feature that is slow to weather. If you look out the window, you can see that it stays there and is what we refer to as an enduring feature. So it's sort of underlying everything that we think of in terms of biological diversity. Next, please. For ecologists like myself, this is a map that the State Geologist's Office and co-workers of mine, Liz Thompson, Bob Zano, and others, Brett Engstrom, I believe, was involved too, Gus Goodwin. This is a simplified map of that 500 units, made down to 11 or 12 units that are understandable to an ecologist like me instead of the 500, but also have more ecological meaning. And what I wanted to point out on this is any area on this that's blue is an area that has calcium-rich limestone, calcium-rich bedrock. The Waits River Formation that is in eastern Vermont, and a lot of marbles and limestone and dolostone in western Vermont near Lake Champlain. And all of the bedrock is interesting. All of it is important, but that limestone bedrock that we have in Vermont is unusual in the region and is very important in terms of flora that develop on it, plants especially that develop on it. It's also really important for agriculture because the calcium-rich bedrock and soils over it are really fertile soils. Next, please. This is a similar map. This is produced by the Nature Conservancy. And in this map, those calcium-rich bedrocks are shown in yellow. And I just wanted to, you can see there in the center how much of Vermont shows up as yellow. And so when we think about sort of conservation targets, how we think about conserving biological diversity, one of the things we should think about is how important are Vermont's examples of calcium-rich bedrock, both for the plants and animals that grow there, but also as a way to represent what's in the region. So we have maybe a an oversized responsibility for working and conserving some of our limestone bedrock, calcium-rich bedrock. Next, please. So after bedrock, the next sort of change were the ice ages and the glaciers that came. I don't actually remember where this glacier is, but over us here in Montpelier, we had about a mile of ice, I'm forgetting now, about 13,000 years ago. Well, that's when it was retreating, so before that. But a mile of ice over us that pushed down on the landscape. These glaciers scraped bedrock, breaking materials loose. There were running waters over the glaciers and in the glaciers depositing materials. For those of you on the western flanks of the Green Mountains, there are these amazing sand areas that go out from the base, sand and gravel areas from waters washing out. So glaciers have shaped our landscape. Next, please. And along with the glaciers, this is a map produced by George Springston, who's a professor at Norwich. The blue are all waters, and the scale on the right here shows some of the ages. This is from, it's hard for me to read, 18,000 up to the present. And there was a time when Lake Champlain was connected to the sea through the St. Lawrence, so it was salt water, and there are whale bones along the shores of Lake Champlain now. And then it became a lake. The thing that's fascinating to me is in the center of this, you can make out Mount Mansfield, near the word Underhill there. And that whole chunk of land at that time was an island surrounded by water because of higher water levels and ice dams, and that was called Glacial Lake Winooski. So formations like that led to very different features in those valleys where there are sediments deposited where those lakes were. And those deposits are what we think of as superficial geology. So it's the geology on top of the bedrock, which is mostly in the map on the left, you'll see is what we call till, where it's just material deposited by the glacier. But you also get in blue, you can see those outwash deposits that are those features formed along lakes, along rivers. And it's also our soils, the soils that are part of every ecosystem, whether they're deep or wet or well-drained or poorly drained. The soils are the basis for many living organisms that we don't think about, soil microorganisms, but also they are what support vegetation and animals above ground. One more aspect of sort of our physical landscape is sort of how that diversity all fits together. This is a model, I think, produced by Charles Ferry and Mark Anderson that shows Mount Mansfield and combinations of landforms on the mountain. And it's not really important to go through all of these. You can get a good sense of what these are about by looking at the landform names. But what's important to think of is on this our largest mountain, there are all these diverse habitats that are formed by differences in landforms based on bedrock, superficial geology, slope and aspect, and elevation. And those are features that endure over time, and those features provide the basis for biological diversity, not just on Mount Mansfield, but every place we have this kind of topographic diversity. Just to point out, when we talk about Vermont, it's been very helpful to break the state up into regions that we call biophysical regions. And there are the 9 of them there. And those are sometimes boundaries that you could almost see. And sometimes they are kind of nebulous boundaries. But the idea is that within each of these biophysical regions, vegetation and climate and sometimes soil and bedrock kind of hold together. So you tend to get units that are features that are similar. You can picture the north and south Green Mountains, higher mountains and colder climate, more precipitation, as compared to the Champlain Valley, where it's low and the warmest in the state, has some of the lowest rainfall, and tends to have very flat soils, many of them clays and features like that. So just a point that these biophysical regions are a useful concept. One of the projects I've worked on over my career is a book called Wetland, Woodland, Wildland with, excuse me, with Liz Thompson and Bob Zano. And a natural community is this interacting assemblage of plants and animals that occur in similar environmental conditions, both physical and ecological processes. And I wanted to spend a little time just sort of looking at some of those to give you a sense of the diversity in the state. And many of you probably are familiar with many of these places. Next, please. I'll just go through these kind of quickly. So on the left is the montane spruce fir forest. So we're high in the Green Mountains. On the right is a boreal acidic outcrop. So acidic bedrock, boreal meaning northern. And this is in the Worcester Range, looking out to kind of a blanket of montane spruce fir forest in the distance. Next, please. Alpine tundra on the top of Mount Mansfield. The top of Camel's Hump. A red oak northern hardwood forest down in Rupert. On the left is a pitch pine and red pine forest in Rutland. And on the right, a sandplain forest, pine oak heath sandplain forest that have a natural tendency to burn. It's sort of a fire-prone environment. This fire was actually set to sort of keep them intact. Next, please. Peacham Bog, one of our largest and really dramatic dwarf shrub bog in Peacham. Black gum swamp in Vernon on the right. Black gum trees are probably, or are the oldest, well, maybe not now. They're one of the oldest trees in Vermont, some up to 4, 5, 6, 700 years old. And these little tiny pocket swamps. Rich fen, this one is in Barnard. Rich fens like this, they're fed by groundwater discharge that is enriched with calcium, so they're over calcium enriched bedrock. And 1 square meter in an area like this can have as many as 30, 60, 70 species of plants, vascular plants and bryophytes, mosses and liverworts, as well as some really showy plants like the showy lady's lily. An alder swamp along a brook in Calais, a river cobble shore along the West River in, not sure what town that's in, but West River near upstream from Brattleboro. So there's a lot of diversity in Vermont, and that was my point in showing those. Just it's at the natural community level, it's at the bedrock level, it's at the superficial geology level, and I didn't even start to talk about species. And we have thousands, tens of thousands of species in the state. So I want to talk about impacts a little bit, and again, zoom out first. This is a slide, a composite slide by NASA of the globe sort of spread out flat and showing lights at night. So it's not dark everywhere at once. So they somehow pulled it together to get one slide to show all of our lights. And it's a good indication of our footprint of where we are and where we are most developed too. I mean, there are sure parts of Africa that have less lights, but maybe have quite a few people. But just an indication of how widespread we are in the world, and especially if you look at Europe and North America. Next, please. And climate change is altering our weather. are temperatures, more severe storms, melting of ice caps and floating ice, and desertification in some parts of the world, and sea level rise. There are many things. Next, please. We don't have some of those things happening here, but we have our own set of climate change issues and threats to biological diversity here in Vermont. The largest, and I think one that you folks are dealing with maybe most, is forest and habitat fragmentation, which is, I think, probably the top of every scientist's lists in terms of threats. It's pervasive across the globe, whether it's the tropical rainforests or whether it's here in Vermont. Other features are things like climate change, temperature, precipitation, storms, and non-native invasive species, like here the woolly adelgid on hemlock woolly adelgid, the emerald ash borer that's starting to take out ashes across the state, and plants that are beautiful but a problem in marshes like purple loosestrife. Next, please. So climate change has really changed how we think about conserving biological diversity. And some of the reasons is that, as I mentioned with past glaciers, we've had periods of dramatic climate change in the past that the Earth recovers from, nature recovers from. What's very different this time is the speed at which climate change is occurring, and really still sort of an uncertain future. We know more and more about what that climate change looks like, but it's still an uncertain future to some extent. That climate change has some direct effects, like warming and how do species move around to adapt to new situations. That I'll talk about more. But there are also some compounding effects, and especially ones relating to land use. Vermont is pretty consistently voted one of the best places to live in the country. Minnesota came out high there recently too in some reports, and like I agree. Sometimes I wish that wasn't advertised so much, but it's a attribution of how wonderful a place it is. The difficulty relating to climate change is as sea levels rise and there are storms. I forget the storm name that hit New York not many years ago. Was it Sandy? As storms like that occur and take out coastal areas, or as water becomes more and more of a shortage in the arid Southwest, people look to places like Vermont, Minnesota, where there's relatively cheap land, and there are plenty of water, and no sea level rise, and what a great culture we have too, and it becomes a place to move to. And I may be a bit of an introvert, but I like people too, and I'm not objecting to people. I'm saying that we need to think about climate change in terms of that effect and how we deal with an increasing population in Vermont. So that was kind of a ramble, but I think it's an important one to think about.
Eric, please.
Yes.
Representative Sibilia has a question.
And so, Eric, thank you. On your last point, recognizing that we already have a lot of climate refugees arriving in Vermont, what are the top maybe two things that you think, if you could get the legislature to think about as we are seeing more climate refugees and anticipating more climate refugees, what are the top two things that you would have us kind of manage or do or think about or prioritize?
Two things, and this is not my area of expertise. One of them might be, the first one isn't. I think we have lots of room in downtowns and communities for housing, for more places for people to live. And we should absolutely prioritize that. My biggest worry, and a lot of your presentations today about forest fragmentation, my biggest worry is nothing against people with lots of money, but they tend to come in and want to build a house in the middle of nowhere with a long driveway going in. And those places now are the types of places that are going to fragment our forests more. So how we get a handle on those is very important. Does that help?
Does help. Does help. That the second piece, when we think about property rights and,
Yes.
Just interested in what are the appropriate incentives and disincentives that respect
Right.
property rights and also achieve our goals in that regard.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the complicated issue. And like, I'll mention some of the features that I'm most concerned about in terms of fragmentation later. And almost all of those, there's a way to build a small house or an enormous house without creating that interior forest fragmentation. And I mean, to me, that's the goal, not to tell people you can't build anywhere, but to how do we direct it so you can live in the place that you own with having the minimal impact on those features. So I mentioned natural communities earlier. That's been a focus of my career. And natural communities are these repeating assemblages of plants and animals. But they are the repeating assemblages of plants and animals we have right now, or for 50 years from now, or for the past 500 years. But we need to expect those to change because each species is going to shift independently in order to find the appropriate habitat for the climate that's coming. So here's the other big thing is prior to European settlement, when indigenous folks lived here for thousands of years, there was no concern about landscape connectivity. The indigenous people's footprint on the landscape was, maybe relatively intense in small communities, but the vast majority of the landscape was intact. Now we have highways and roads and all these barriers to landscape connectivity. Landscape connectivity, I mean the ability of animals to move, but also plants to shift over time. So we need to think about landscape connectivity now when we think about climate change. And we need to conserve that physical landscape diversity because it's sort of the underlying part on which species develop. Next, please. So the slide there at the bottom is road crossings are something that I've never thought about as a place that you need to conserve. But there's a bobcat crossing a road, I think somewhere in the Champlain Valley. And those places where animals cross the roads, I mean, we have to think about those places as this section of road is important for animal movement. And that's a conflict with a house going in that place. And it's another one that butts right up against property rights issues, but it's also like, if we want animals to move across the landscape, we need to figure out we know where a lot of those places are, and we need to figure out how to keep those areas intact. Next, please.
Representative Stemmons has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Eric. This is fascinating. Not a question, just an FYI that actually the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators has a whole list of things that legislators could do about wildlife crossings. And in particular, apparently there are a fair amount of federal grants right now that do require a match, but just for what it's worth.
If there are folks in Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, John Austin and Jens Hilke that work, and let me see, somebody else now too, that work almost, or not exclusively, but largely on wildlife connectivity issues. And it would be, if you have other ideas about that, it'd be great to get them in. And they work very closely with the transportation agency on how to make things work or not. But it's
right, because it also has, a safety component to it with crashes and
absolutely, like
an economic cost.
What do you do with guardrails that restrict animal movement? And do you need them everywhere? You need them some places for sure. So
Representative Logan.
Thank you. Do you know who within state government works on ecological continuity, ecological process continuity? Familiar with wildlife issues, but
Well, my job there was that. Bob Zane, that's his job now as the sort of lead ecologist in the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. But I would say it's across all three departments in the agency. Like there are folks that focus on river integrity in the rivers program, and we tend to have blinders on sometimes in state government and look at our particular issues. So they're wildlife focused continuity, ecological and continuity issues. So they're kind of point people across. There are folks that can talk to issues for the whole department from each department, I would say.
And we did invite Mr. Zano in, and we will have him in next week. He was unavailable this week.
So just a couple slides just as an illustration. This is a little dated from maybe 10 years ago or so, but what I wanted to show is the differences in the size of forest blocks. So blocks that are relatively unfragmented by roads across the Northeast. So everything of the color here, there's kind of a mistake in here. If you think of lakes as blocks too, they're included. You can see Lake Champlain is there and the Finger Lakes are included too. And I think the big reservoir in Massachusetts is too. What's it called? Quabbin, thank you. So blocks 20 acres and larger. Next, please.
Sorry, the white is what?
The white is areas that are either agriculture, developed, or blocks of forest less than 20 acres.
Got it. Thank you.
So the Champlain Valley shows up that way because there are very few large blocks there. So here are blocks over 500 acres. You can see there are very few in the Champlain Valley now, but a lot in northern Maine and the Adirondacks. Next, please. Here are blocks over 2,000 acres. So Lake Champlain, you can see some in the Champlain Valley, probably Snake Mountain or something like that. And the Green Mountains stand out, Northeast Kingdom stands out. Next, please. And 5,000 acres. And here you can see there's almost nothing in Massachusetts. I like to look at this and think, look at all the opportunity we have in Vermont still. Even though 5,000 acres is forest-wise, that's not a big forest, given that the state is 6 million plus acres. So, but just to illustrate that scale, we are responsible for the size of those blocks. Like that's something that we've created. I think of the forest blocks now as something to work with. They are the place where we have the most ecological integrity. And it gets to your question about how do we maintain those forest blocks and still have uses, whether it's harvesting or residences. Next, please. So first two of these are way off my topic, but I can't talk about what we do without mentioning, we do know what to do. One of them is stabilizing the human population. It's continuing to go up. Food production across the world accounts for 30% of our greenhouse gases. We are too many. We're surviving, we're doing okay, but we can't continue to grow and also maintain biological diversity. We also need to think about how we reduce our consumption of earth resources. The idea of stability in an economy so that we have some sense of we live here, we thrive, happiness is considered, and we cannot have continued growth. There's no way to have continued growth because continued growth can only come from using more of nature, bedrock, those features. Social justice and equity, we need those, and I have no big help there. So my part, is we need landscape scale conservation, which is a little new for how we do stuff, new in the past 10, 15, 20 years. But we also need traditional means of protecting biological diversity.
We have a question from Representative Smith.
Thank you. Could you go into a little bit more detail on what you mean by social justice and equity?
Sure.
Where it involves ecology.
Well, that's where I mentioned I'm straying from my topic. But as a citizen, I can't miss those aspects of our footprint on the earth. What I mean by that is unequal distribution of wealth. That means some people are able to live in very nice environmental settings, and some are in dangerous or starvation situations. So there's that kind of justice. There's also a justice in the environmental sense of where do we put highways, where do we have landfills, those kind of situations. That's what I mean. But I think it's a. Does that help at all?
It's not an understandable answer, but that's okay for now.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not clear.
That's fine.
Next slide, please. So I just wanted to mention some of the features across the Northeast that have solutions on how we conserve biological diversity. One is this wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities from Harvard Forest. David Foster has been the lead on that, which is calling for 10% natural wildlands, productively managed woodlands, 60% farmlands, and other. So it's sort of a goal for the Northeast. Next, please. The Nature Conservancy has been working on this issue for years, and they've pretty much expanded this map across the country now, and it's up into Canada, maybe more places now, but they refer to it as their resilient and connected landscapes. And it's a very cool website too to look at. You can look at places that are connected and resilient to climate change and have high biological diversity. So it gives us a sense of where to focus. Next, please. The Half Earth project led by E.O. Wilson, late E.O. Wilson. And this is a little bit more general in sense. It doesn't get you to specific places on the ground at the scale that we need, I think, but it's a call for half the earth being conserved at some scale. What level of conservation isn't clear to me. Next, please.
But Eric, can we go back for a second on that one? What is the bright green in the ocean?
I'm sorry, I can't tell you, Chair. I think, let me see, I think I have biodiversity turned on. So I think it's this is just one slide from their website. It's a cool website, and you can go through and see where hotspots are and where these different features occur. So it's I just wanted to show some examples, and I think that probably links into biodiversity.
Representative Sibilia has a question also.
Yeah, so the Half Earth proposal, is half the Earth not developed at this point?
That's correct.
Interesting, okay. I'm surprised.
Yeah, well, I think it's in varying stages of development, but part of what I'll get to later is it's not just setting aside deserts or high mountain peaks. If we want to conserve biological diversity, we need to set aside, I shouldn't say set aside, we need to conserve so that we maintain their functions. We need to conserve the full range of places. So hemlock forests and mountaintops and rich forests and all the different features as representative to get to whatever these goals are. I like our goals in Vermont that I want to explain to you more. This one is general for me, but it's a concept. E.O. Wilson is kind of revered in the scientific community for his thinking, and it's a call that we need to act. I think is what it is.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. To clarify, this concept relates to land, not ocean.
Land and water is my understanding. Land and water, yes. I think most of those concepts do apply to both. And there are folks here in Vermont who could explain this much better than me. Kurt,
He lives in Waitsville.
do you remember Kurt?
Lindbergh?
Thank you.
I don't think of us necessarily as actively developing the ocean. I mean, we have a lot of plastics in it, and we have, oil riggers, and we use it for transport. But I guess we use it more as a dumping and as a extraction thing, not as a.
I think that's exactly it, that it's the extraction of fish that changes populations. It's, are there places that are safe for species to evolve? Their sound influences on whales and dolphins. I mean, again, that's way outside my field, but the idea is like, it's a very different thing than how do you maintain our hemlock forest,
right?
But there are similar ways that we should look at those oceans that we don't have in Vermont, but look at those and what's needed to conserve the functions there. Next, please. Last one I want to mention of these that we know of for the area is Staying Connected Initiative. And this is a consortium of lots of state and non-NGOs around the Northeast and Canada looking at important connectivity places in the Northeast. And there are those, how many are there? 6, 8, 9 priority linkages identified for the area. You'll see that 6 of those are in Vermont. Dr. Irwin mentioned this too about the importance of Vermont for connectivity, and some of those same places show up there in the Nature Conservancy's analysis too, and in our statewide Vermont conservation design. So this is the big question. These numbers are a little outdated now. I think we think there are probably more species than that, but the point is still clear that we have some huge number of species in the state, and the little pie diagram there shows the ones that we have better information about, especially vascular plants and vertebrate animals, and even, but you start looking at fungi and invertebrates, and we don't really know how many there are. So if we're going to conserve biological diversity, we need to conserve all of those. And I would say it's really impossible for us to come up with a plan on how to conserve all of them when we don't even know what most of them are. So we have to come up with a different approach. Next, please. And the approach that's been used historically in conservation is one called a coarse filter and fine filter approach, with the idea being that if you can identify larger scale features, features that sort of represent the needs of many species, and we can conserve a smaller set of those species, those larger scale features. I'll explain what I mean by those. Then we bring along the species that come with them. We used to do this mostly with natural communities, sort of the hemlock forest or northern hardwood forest or montane spruce fir forest and the species that came with those. But those tend to be small, patchy features, and they don't get at the landscape scale conservation that we need now. So the idea of this is the wood turtle there on the left. If you conserve alluvial shrub swamps along brooks, we'll conserve wood turtles. Or the black spruce swamp there in the Northeast Kingdom, if we conserve enough good examples of black spruce swamp, we can conserve spruce grouse, which is found exclusively in those, and this rare moss called spalagnum that grows on moose dung. So there's really specific little connections, and I mean that's just one we know about. There are all kinds of things we don't know about. Next, please. So we need coarser filters than those natural communities. Next, please. So, and that's what the Vermont conservation design is about. I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is something that Bob Zano could go into much more detail, and I hope that works for you.
Well,
So it's Vermont conservation design is something that was state came up with working on. It was a 10-year process to produce. It's the basis for or a large part of the state wildlife action plan, which results in public funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But it's a vision on how we conserve biological diversity. I like to think of it as practical and scientific too. I think that's, and sometimes I think of it as being more practical than some of the other plans I mentioned earlier. And I don't mean to denigrate those. I just think this is more specific to Vermont and more helpful. It uses recognizable features, forest blocks that you can walk into and you know you're in that block because the road's there and you know the forest chunk that you're in, or riparian areas along rivers and lakes. And it depends on thoughtful stewardship and management. And by that, I mean conservation, where we are having ecological reserves. I mean conservation where we have working forests, places where we are managing for products. And it includes both state lands, federal lands, and private lands.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, so stewardship and management, ideally, I think I know where that should be happening. Where would you say that should be happening? I asked that question from an oversight role.
Yep.
So where should that be happening? Who should be doing that, providing that stewardship and management?
It's easiest for me to say where it should be happening by, we have other things that we need some lands for. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. There are some places.
Geographically.
No, I understand.
Okay.
There's some places, some features that we need to conserve at the highest level where we have no forest management or only management for ecological enhancement, maybe, if they're invasive species. Old forests, high quality examples of natural communities. Some of those features we should manage by letting them be. There are some other areas that we need to manage fairly.
I apologize. I don't want to take away from your time. So I don't think you're answering my question. So I wasn't clear. Who should be providing oversight on this stewardship and management? Whose job is that? Is that FPR's job? Whose job is it to ensure appropriate stewardship and management? Remembering this is a new world for me.
Right. Well, on state lands right now, it's the job of the state land stewardship teams to come up with a plan for each individual piece of land. And
They work for.
Forest and Parks, Fish and Wildlife, Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Like those teams at each district come up with a management plan for each piece of state land, considering an array of issues.
Okay.
That's 400,000 acres in the state, plus or minus. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Forest Service has another set of operating plans on how they develop those. Those are a little bit more obtuse to get into, but they are still management plans. And then private land ownership is, that's up to the landowner. Use value appraisal is our biggest asset. 2 million acres involved in use value appraisal, giving landowners tax relief for managing their lands. And those management plans are overseen by consulting foresters and county foresters to meet guidelines. So that's 800,000 plus or minus acres plus another 2 million. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. There are lots of lands that there's no oversight for, and I mean that's part of the Vermont way. I think right? that some people don't want to enroll in use value appraisal because they don't want to be told what to do.
Right.
Next slide, please. A lot of folks involved in Vermont conservation design. Next slide, please. I think I better speed up a bit. So this is the map of Vermont conservation design results. Everything with a color there is considered a highest priority area. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The result would these lands and waters conserved would result in an intact, connected, and diverse landscape, one that's ecologically functional. And just based on our conversation so far, I want to make it really clear that this is not a call for all of these, everything in a color here to be off limits. This is a call for all of these areas. We want to maintain ecological functions in these areas, which means good wildlife habitat, forests that have intactness, water quality, fish habitat. So it's how do we maintain all those things from that area? Next, please. And the Vermont conservation design is based on 3 scales, these landscape scale features, natural community scale features, and then species level too. I'll run through some of the 2 larger scales quickly. I want to mention that coarse filter approach, these are the features that are identified in Vermont conservation design as those coarse filters. Interior forests down to wildlife road crossings and natural communities down to underground habitats. Those are the things that if we conserve good examples, we're going to bring along almost all of our species if we can do it. There are always going to be some species that need help, that need specific help. And whether it's deer because we have a social interest in them and want to manage for them, or it's a rare plant like this orchid, we need to be aware of what species we need to manage for specifically. Next, please. So here are all the maps of those coarse filter features put together. Interior forest blocks are the largest blocks in each biophysical region that have high integrity, and they are important for species that use interior forests. That's many species of birds, it's many species of mammals, and they are places where we can count on the forests being ecologically intact. Connectivity blocks are a similar set of blocks, forest blocks, but the difference is you can see those connectivity blocks include some smaller blocks that result in a continuous strips of or continuous ways for species to move over time. So it includes smaller blocks in areas where it's congested with human uses. There isn't a river or stream or lake or pond that isn't important, so they're all included in the surface waters and riparian areas. And then physical landscape diversity, the tan in that right-hand slide is all of these other features, but it's added those red areas to fully represent bedrock and other physical features. So the combination of these together is those landscape diversity features. Next, please. At that natural community scale, there are natural communities that are identified in the state. We're always finding more. Many are on private land. They can be enrolled in use value appraisal for different treatments. Many are on state land and federal land too. There are some special aquatic features like high elevation streams that are especially important for brook trout and especially as climate warms. There are the rivers that flow into Lake Champlain that have bizarre fish populations that are traced back to Lake Champlain being a sea and its long history. There are all of our state wetlands. And in the upper right-hand corner there are underground habitats that are important for bats, but also a bunch of other creatures that we know very little about. We don't really share maps of those because those habitats are pretty special. Next, please. There are also some features that we don't have mapped directly, but they are sort of targets that we need to fully represent ecological conditions. One of those is young forests that right now we are short on as our forests mature. So we need more young forests. We have ranges of 3 to 5%, something like that by biophysical region. Those are important for many species of birds, for browse, for some pollinators. We also need old forests. And we need, right now we have way less than 1% of old forests. The target in Vermont conservation design is 9% of the state or 15% of those forest blocks. So the idea is to have them within those forest blocks. And those are places where you can think of them as where evolution occurs, where we have the greatest resilience to climate change in those old forest conditions. We need more of those. And there are features like grasslands that are in some ways kind of outside of the forest blocks, or they are outside. There are places that are agricultural lands now that host species that weren't here prior to European settlement, but that we have a responsibility for now. So how do we maintain those? Next, please. So again, here's that map of Vermont conservation design, maintaining an intact and connected and functionally diverse landscape. Next, please. I want to point out that like I did this project when I was in state government as a science-driven project, and it becomes very clear, not just from this project, but from all that we all deal with, that conserving biological diversity does a lot more than conserve, protect nature. It's those areas are also where we recreate. We get clean water and air. We have our sense of place. That's why Vermont's so special. They include working farms and forests. And I like to think of them as benefits from nature instead of services. They're kind of gifts from nature to people, not something that we are owed, I think. Next, please. Again, Vermont conservation design is not something that has any regulatory authority. It's a vision for if we want to maintain an ecologically functional landscape, we have a pretty solid plan on how to do it. And I think we're unique in the Northeast for the detail of this plan and what we can get from it. 80% of Vermont is privately owned, and this will only work if we support landowners in making decisions and helping them maintain their land, and especially the ecological functional parts of their land. There are 10, 12 features, elements identified in Vermont conservation design, and it's not sort of a smorgasbord to pick one or the other. We need all of those. And some organizations may do better in some, and some organizations may work better to conserve others. And landowners are a big part of that. But we need to come up with how we balance the uses across all of those features. A really key part of this is that we need to have a sense of permanence for some of those features. Some of the features, you can think of the ones that you can't have an old forest that is cut in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years and attribute function to that old forest. So some features need permanence attached to them, whether that's by conservation easement or ownership, either way. And some features don't need that kind of permanence as dramatically, like forests that are managed in places that aren't key to connectivity or key or sensitive natural communities. Next, please. I won't go through these. I'm close on time here, but I just want to mention that there are a lot of ways that Vermont conservation design is being used now. See a couple of those. Next, please. And I also wanted to mention that there's work here that clearly involves in Vermont conservation design, including potential changes to Act 250. Right now, there's no way to directly work on conservation of forest blocks and landscape activity. That's been something that's been in the works for years, and it's just hard to nail down, it seems like. There's the bill about conserving biological diversity and the level of conservation needed, H606. The recent adoption of reserve forest in the use value appraisal program is a big step, I think, and an option for landowners. It's one other option to encourage landowners to enroll. And you'll hear a lot about the Vermont Climate Action Plan this afternoon from Ms. Lazorchak, and that mentions Vermont conservation design quite a bit. Next, please.
Oh, do you have a question?
I do.
Representative Stebbins has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You had a few slides back in terms of the benefits of nature.
Mhm.
And, I think a lot of Vermonters agree with you in terms of the general benefits of nature and biodiversity. But I also think that there is, ultimately a push-pull in terms of, well, I need to work and I need to actually have a job. And what does this mean economically? And I wonder, I saw once some quote about, so what I'm saying is for folks who are like biodiversity, what does that matter? I saw some stats once about like what percentage of our medicines and essentially everything that we rely on for like heart disease and diabetes coming from rare plants and the fact that in some places we have a lot of biodiversity. Are you familiar with any of those? And if you are, could you send it to us? Because I think part of this is rounding out the conversation of like, it's not necessarily about saving the earth. It's about humans really figuring out how to keep the earth intact for us.
Yes, I sure have read about the medicines, that sort of thing derived from plants, sometimes from animals too. And probably not as much here in Vermont. It's probably more of a tropical thing. But, I don't have any specific knowledge about that myself. To me, the idea is that there's plenty of room to share for all these. The idea of balance in this is that we're actually doing it now. Like if we could conserve what we have now, the system we have now, we're in good shape. And if we focus our development downtown and in areas that are villages, I mean, but not just there. I mean, in edges of forest blocks is fine too. We need and we know where those places are that are most sensitive now, and it's how to create that balance. Biodiversity again is that whole big picture, and it's something that we rely on for medicines and stuff like that for sure. But it's also how we got to where we are as people. You know, we evolved like everyone else, like all the other species, and it's sort of, to me, it's that responsibility both to nature and to future generations to be able to experience it. So there are lots of efforts to put price tags on various elements of environmental services, clean water, clean air. I'm always hesitant to do that because I feel like it's a responsibility we have to keep those, even though we do benefit enormously from it. If that helps. It's a little circular, but
No, it's helpful. Thank you.
that's all. I just wanted to, so you have these links to, if you want to see the details of Vermont conservation design. BioFinder is a tool to look at the maps produced in Vermont conservation design. You can do it with any laptop. Wetland Woodland Wildland is the book that I'm a co-author on with Liz and Bob. And again, just a call out for getting Bob in here sometime to talk to you about Vermont conservation design. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. It's just about 11 o'clock. I'd like to take a break till 10 past the hour, and then we'll